All right. Hey, how are you? Welcome to the Coding Zoo. I've had a great week. I hope you have had a great week. Today at the Coding Zoo, we're going to learn more about promises. In our last lesson, we learned a little bit about JavaScript promises. Today, we're going to jump in and learn how to manage multiple promises at once by using the all method on the promise object. So if you've never seen Promise.all or you're not sure how it works, hey, stick around, we're going to jump right in. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So on my desktop, I have a file called main.js, and I also have a file called index.html, which links to the main.js. So just to rehash, in our last lesson, we learned about promises. We learned that a promise is an object in JavaScript that can be used to wrap asynchronous processes that kind of run behind the scenes of your main process, and that object can be used to communicate to you when that asynchronous process is done, whether it's successful, whether it had an error. The way you create a promise, we also learned how to do that in the last lesson. You do that by using new promise, and it has a constructor that takes in a function, and the function that the promise takes in the parameters resolve and reject, which are basically functions. You would use those functions in your code here to say, well, I've resolved what I'm doing. I'm done doing my parallel process. Let's move forward. You'd also could use reject to say, well, I'm done, but I wasn't successful, and here's why. We learned that in the last lesson. I'll put a link at the end of this video. Be sure to check it out if you want to go more in depth on that particular subject. So on my screen, I have a function. It's called finished. It basically just writes out something to the document window, to the HTML window. And I have three promises that I've created. Promise 1, promise 2, promise 3. The first one waits 8 seconds. And so this is kind of, pretending to do something asynchronously, or rather I am doing something asynchronously, I'm waiting. But just imagine this set timeout is like calling a network or something. So I'm basically using set timeout to mock or mimic to mimic a asynchronous process like calling a network. After 8 seconds, I'm done calling my fake network, and it's going to write promise 1 is done. Same for here, but it's 5 seconds. It's going to say promise 2 is done. Same for here, but 1 second, it's going to say promise 3 is done. Below this, I'm actually using the then function to find out when each one of these are done and write out the value that is returned in the resolve. So you'll notice my set timeout, it takes in a function. I'm passing in the resolve function. This is how long before that function is called, and this is what the set timeout will pass to that function after the amount of time allocated. So after 1 second, resolve is going to be called, and it's going to pass this value. Well, down here, I'm actually waiting for that to happen. I'm taking that value and I'm writing it out to the screen. So I also at the very end here call a function called finished. So I'm going to write out each of these values that are passed back through resolve, and I'm going to run finished. And finished is going to write I'm done with all. So what do you think is going to happen here? Will it first write each of these out and then call finish, or will it start these and then continue on and parallel and go ahead and run finish before these are done? What will happen? Well, let's see. Now watch it real quick. Pay very close attention. I'm done with all. Promise 3 done, which is promise 2 done, promise 1 done. It didn't do it in order, and it definitely ran the finished code first. Now I want the code finished to run last. So how do I make sure that something happens after all three of these promises are done? Let's imagine you have 3 parallel processes. You have 3 asynchronous processes, And you need to do some work after all three of those items are done. How would you do that? We can see here that if I were to put the code after those three asynchronous processes ran, well, they're still running in the background, and this keeps going and runs finished. So that won't work. How do I do that? Well, one way you might could do it is to chain these then functions together. So I could do promise3 then, document write the value, promise2 then, document write the value, promise1 then, write the value. I don't believe that's optimal, so it may still run in parallel, but you won't get the results immediately from each one of those parallel processes. And then finished is written at the end. So let's try it. Let's see if that works. Let's make sure that works. So refresh. Okay, nothing on the screen. Promise3 is done. And again, it doesn't matter if 1 is done. 1's not going to be written until 2 is done. But all right, so it was able to perform all three of those processes, and it did I am done with all at the very, very end. So I was able to wait for all three of those processes to be done and then print something out. Is this optimal? Well, no, it's not optimal. First, the code is hard to read, hard to maintain. There's a lot simpler way. Let's look at that. So basically, I'm going to use Promise.all to know when these items are done. So let's type in promise, capital P, .all. So I'm calling a function on the promise called all. I'm going to pass in an array, and of course I'm going to pass in the array of the other promises that I want to wait on. So promise 1, promise 2, promise 3, and then I am, don't you like how that interface works? I'm waiting on something, and then I'm going to do something else. Very self-explanatory. So then, and I'm going to pass in a function, values, and I'm going to document write each of those values. And I'm going to call the task I wanted to do once all of them were finished. And that's basically it. So this is very hard to understand, very hard to read. This is very simple and will perform better. So Promise.all, and then you give the list of promises you want to wait on, and then you give it a function of what you want to do once those promises are done. Let's try it out. All right, it did not call it the finished. It did not write the finished yet. I'm waiting for all of them to be done, and boom. So all of them are done, and it wrote out all three of the values. So I'm done with all. So it did everything at the end, basically. Hey, so that's it. Pretty simple. If you have more than one promise that you want to wait on to finish before you do something else, instead of using promise.then on each one of those promises, you would use the utility function promise.all. You'd pass in those promises as an array, and then you would set up your then with a function that contains the logic that you want to do after those promises are done. A very cool interface to know about in case you run across the situation where you need to wait on multiple asynchronous processes. I hope that makes sense. If not, hey, leave me a question below. I'd love to help you in any way I can. I'd love to, definitely will get back to you. If you like this video, at the bottom below, you should see a like button. Please click that like button. It definitely helps. Also, if you haven't clicked subscribe yet, please go ahead and click the subscribe button below. We're going to have a lot of new videos coming up soon. We're going to cover more JavaScript, and we're also jumping into Java, do a little server-side programming. So hey, I hope that interests you, and I hope to see you next time. Have a great